to further build on them. So I'm not quite able to advance the slide yet with this. Oh, looks like that works out. Lovely. Rubrics are assessment guides defining criteria and expectations for students and instructors. So they help us with assessment. And because of that, since assessment needs to be connected to our learning goals for the course, so the rubrics also needs to be written with learning goals in mind. They define criteria and expectation. We'll talk about what that is and what how different rubrics might approach criteria. And then they are for students and for instructors. So one of the best practices when you're using rubrics is that you write your rubrics ahead of time and then you publish your rubrics so that the students can look at them as they prepare the assignment, and then that way they know what to expect and also what is expected of them. And at the same time, they're helpful for instructors. I'll go through some of the, well, this is a rubric in case you'd like to see an example. So this is for coffee shops, right? We could, if we visit a coffee shop, we could look at the quality of the coffee. We could look at the variety of coffees available. This we could look at, the art that's on top of the coffee. We could look at the ambiance of the coffee shop, and we could use each of these criteria and then define different levels of success and satisfaction. And it might be a coffee shop that's really good at one thing, not so good at others. And if we were grading and assessing our coffee shops here in Lahore, we could use that as a guide. So here's some advantages. For instructors, rubrics save time. So this summer, for example, I was teaching a course that had a lot of assessments, and one of the assessments involved grading about 50 reports, about 60 reports every week. And so I figured ahead of time, in order to do that, I would have to get my time spent per report to 2 minutes or less. And I was wondering how to do that. I came up with using a rubric, and that way I could select the levels of success for each criteria. Basically, I have to read the report in 1 minute, and then within a few seconds, I can select the levels of success. And that way, students actually have feedback, whereas in that short time, I would not be able to write feedback. So that this is what was not so strong, this is what was strong, here's how to improve. But the rubrics already provide that feedback by showing, okay, this is where you were successful, this is where you could improve further. And so it helps get the time spent grading down while still offering substantial feedback. Rubrics also reduce uncertainty because they help define expectations based on objective measures. And so sometimes if you have a pile of paper, 20 or 30 or 40, by the time you get to the last one, you're no longer sure what was I thinking when I graded the first 5 or 10 papers. Do I need to go back and compare? And of course, sometimes that's a good idea, but rubrics reduce that uncertainty by giving you something specific to hold on to. Rubrics increase consistency for the same reason. And both of these, reducing uncertainty and increasing consistency, also helps to save time because it reduces the amount that you have to sort of accommodate for marker fatigue, where you sort of after 1 hour of grading, you're not sure, do I have the same standards now that I'm a little bit annoyed by or a little bit frustrated with the mistakes that have been made? Have I gotten harsher? Have I gotten softer? And the rubrics, because they provide some structure, help improve consistency and therefore reduce the amount of time that you need to spend by going back and comparing with your earlier graded papers again. And then rubrics encourage assessment based on learning outcomes. And this is a point where we connect to our course design. We're not going to go into how to write learning outcomes. We're going to assume that your courses are designed that you have some kind of learning outcomes and that you are writing your assessments in light of those learning outcomes. But when we think about rubrics, we're going to connect to some of those learning outcomes. And that helps us as instructors to make sure that our courses are not misaligned because the assessments match the learning outcomes. Here's some advantages for students. Students can understand expectations better when they see the rubrics, and they provide specific feedback. So before students submit the assessment, they know what they're going to be graded on, so they understand the expectations. And then after they've got feedback for their assessment, they can see for the rubric, okay, so on this first one, maybe style and clarity, I got a very high score, so that means that that's something that I'm already comfortable with. But then in terms of structure of the paper, I got a low score. So I need to remember in the future to write an introduction and a conclusion and to use section headings and these kinds of things, right? And so based on using a rubric, you are already able to provide that feedback, and that helps students even if you are in the situation where you have a large class and you're not able to write substantial written feedback for each paper. Rubrics also document progress. This is especially relevant in a course where you have similar assignments over and over again. So for example, reading reports that you expect every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks, and they're going to do 5, 6, 7, 8 of those over the course of the semester. And they can see, okay, the criteria, the points where I was weaker on the earlier reports, am I getting better on those, right? So they document students' progress across time in that situation. There's some advantages for programs as well. So once again, rubrics encourage assessment based on learning outcomes, which is relevant when you're assessing program success. They also ensure consistency across sections so that different instructors are using the same standards and you don't get a situation where sort of rumors start spreading, oh, this instructor is really soft and that professor is really harsh and these kind of things. Then you've got advantage also with consistency across time. So if I'm teaching the same course for several years, especially in my postgraduate courses, some of the groups are a bit smaller, right? You don't necessarily have 30 students. And with smaller classes, you're going to have more variation. You might have a really strong cohort one year, a weaker cohort the other year. So then if the class overall is a little bit weaker, are you still grading them by the same standards? Or do you sort of have a student that gets lucky, student might meet the same standards, but because their peers are perhaps not as strong, they get a higher grade and so on. So it helps ensure consistency across time that way. So, and then finally, they may simplify program assessment. In some situations, say you have program learning outcomes, and you have a course where you're assessing one of those program learning outcomes. Well, perhaps in that course, you have a final paper, and some aspect of that final paper matches onto a program learning outcome, say ability to write research or something like that. And then you could capture success on that outcome by looking at that criterion of the rubric, assuming it's an analytic rubric, get to the different types of rubrics. So there's some advantages. I'm going to so it sounds like this mic, according to the vote from the chat, is perhaps better. Please keep letting us know if the technology is working. So I'm going to stop here for a moment and just wait for questions and comments. And I realize that some of the folks here in the room and also on online have been teaching you longer than I have. So I'm eager to get questions, but also comments and your experience. Yes.
So when you say rubrics ensure consistency across time, how do you think that applies to when you have a batch of particularly strong students, but once in a while you get a batch that is not very strong? So would you suggest grading them on the same level or based on their progress over time?
Right. So that's a very good question. Doing grade based on progress or consistent across time. So I think that when you are aiming for consistency across time, rubrics can help with that. I do realize that there's different approaches. In my classes, I tend to try to afford effort, but not independent of effectiveness, right? So students who put an effort and are also reaching learning goals effectively, they can expect higher grades, whereas the sheer effort by itself and not necessarily to a good grade. So to some extent, I'm looking for some kind of absolute standards, but what are you reaching? And so specifically, what we have full of A students, we want to still be able to give them A's, even though we think that A students, they might be average, but then average doesn't necessarily mean B because this cohort just stands out as being exceptionally strong. Similarly, the group of students that tend to in what they tend to be below average. I don't want to give them say just because they're maybe average in their group, and we have other students that are not doing as well as them. But I want to keep in mind some not maybe absolute standards is the wrong word, but based on experience over several years, what can we generally expect of students so that there's less of an issue with getting lucky or unlucky depending on how strong your peers are. But I think to some extent it's going to be both ends. All right, sound like any comments from the online community? Do let me know, please. Okay. Once again, trying to use my clicker. So it's good to disconnect it. Oh, lovely. All right. If you're looking at the CLT material, the official story is that there's three types of rubrics. Mentioned holistic rubrics, which is where you can define one short if you say aim for an excellent paper, this is what an excellent paper looks like. If you have a paper, this is what a good paper looks like. Analytic rubrics, rubrics is separating it from the style, thesis statement, another one might be structure, these kinds of things. And then you've got a third one, developmental rubrics. This relies on having a theory of development. My experience or my expectation is that most of you probably don't need to worry about developmental rubrics. So I'm actually not going to say anything about the third category. I'm going to focus on holistic and analytic rubrics. Here's just an example for talking about when I mean criteria and what I'm talking about when I mean levels. So in this rubric that we looked at earlier with the copy, right, we put all the criteria on the left. These are the rows. They go down. And then we have the different levels of success or levels of mastery. These are here on the top. Now on your rubric, it might be different. You might have the criteria in the columns and the levels of success in the rows. I've seen both, so even apparently very experienced and expert educators might use one or the other, depending on what layout works. And you're going to have levels. Sometimes they are ascending, sometimes they are descending. That's okay. But for criteria, I'm talking about the different things that you are trying to work on. And the levels are going to be the different levels in terms of the success, very successful, excellent, good, not so good, these kinds of things. Another way of looking at types of rubrics would be to ask does it have one dimension or two dimension in terms of the table or the chart that you're creating. Do you have sort of only rows or only columns that matter, or is it both rows and columns? So the two-dimensional one was this one. So it had both. You can go across and you can go down, and that would be an analytic rubric, right? So you've got several criteria in one dimension, and then you've got the several different levels of mastery in the other dimension. But for me, that tends to be what I think of first when I think of creating a rubric or when I hear of rubrics. The other one that was mentioned, the holistic rubric, that's the one where you have several different levels, but you don't have separate criteria. So you have you just say you have an excellent paper does this, a good paper does this, an average paper does this third thing, and each of them are defined all together instead of having them separated out for criteria. There's one last one that I'm going to mention. You can also have the opposite where you have several different criteria, but actually only one level is defined. That's a single point rubric. I'll just show a quick example of that in a moment, just so that these different types are clear. So here's an example of a holistic rubric that I've used in one of my courses. So you can see that on the side here we've got 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. That's the grade out of 10. And then for each of those, I have a couple of lines describing this level. So incidentally, this is for an in-class assessment where people are reading, in this case in Hebrew, but it could be sort of in any foreign language where you're writing with text. So are you able to read this smoothly? Are you able to pronounce it correctly? And then are you able to translate and interpret as well? And those to some extent go together. So I ended up using a holistic rubric for this one. The other big one is the analytic rubric. And this is the one that we saw earlier for the coffee shop, but now I have a real example from one of my courses. So I have the criteria style, cases, structure, and citations. And for each of those, I have different levels. In this case, A, B, C, and D. There's different ways of doing the levels. You can just use a letter grade like I did here. Often people do numbers like 100, 90, 80, and so on. And sometimes they use descriptive adjective like excellent, good, average. Of course, if you use adjectives, you still need to at some point translate that back into a grade because for the sake of compiling your course grade, you need some kind of number. And then for each one, you describe the level of success that you can have at each level. Very briefly, I'm just going to show a single point rubric as well. So here we still got our separate criteria in terms of style, cases, structure, and citations, but we don't actually define this for several different levels. We just have one description of success. And then this allows you as the instructor to say you're grading something, you can then write in manually, okay, here's some evidence of how you met or exceeded the standard. Here's some evidence, some areas of improvement. It's kind of useful in some cases where you want the rubric to prompt you to write written comments. Really sorry, I think so. We are getting a lot of distortion in the mic. That's unfortunate. Can you try the podium mic? Okay. Ma'am, can anyone from the
Daniel, I think if you stand near the podium and the laptop, perhaps the laptop sound is better. These mics are hopeless. I don't know all three of them. I'm so sorry, but this is an ITS issue, not ours.
You hear us now clearly?
No, it's still breaking up.
Ma'am, can you check now?
Yeah, same. There is a distortion.
What about me? Can you hear my melodious voice?
Your melodious voice is very good, but once you start talking, then the distortion starts, in somewhere and gets bad. If you start talking, I'm sorry for stopping you, but we'll let you know.
Okay. All right, lovely. So I'm going to move on to some key questions to ask when you are designing rubrics. So this takes you from the learning outcomes or learning goals that you should already have in your course, and then through writing a rubric for that assessment. I'm assuming that at some point, of course, you've designed your assessment. We'll talk a little bit about that, but not too much. we'll focus on the rubric. But the first one is, what are your learning outcomes? So you might have 5 or 6 learning outcomes for the course, but which ones of those are relevant for this assignment? And then what tasks demonstrate these learning outcomes? So this is part of actually designing the assignment. What are students going to be actually doing here in order to demonstrate that they've achieved these learning outcomes? And then third, this is where it gets interesting. What criteria are relevant for evaluating these tasks? And this is where you, if you're writing an analytic rubric, this is going to be either your rows or your columns, but that's a big part of the rubric. If you are writing a holistic rubric, then you might not need to put them in separate columns, but for each individual level of success, you're still going to have separate criteria. So that not separate, but you're going to have several points to that, right? So with a holistic rubric, you don't necessarily have. It's not that you don't have criteria. You just summarize all the criteria together in one place, whereas with the analytic rubric, you separate them out into rows or columns. And then the last question is, what levels of mastery are appropriate for these criteria? So how can you write something that's ideally short, but should still clarify for your students and for your graders, I mean yourself, but perhaps also other instructors if there's several sections of the course, how this assignment should be scored. The last point is kind of the most interesting or maybe the trickiest when you're writing rubrics. But actually third and fourth, so sometimes when you are writing rubrics and also when you're going back to revise them, to troubleshoot them, this is not quite working as I hoped. Sometimes you have to sort of add criteria or merge criteria. And in my experience, even more commonly, I find myself tweaking the definitions at the levels of mastery. So that's where you'll end up some of the time that you spend designing a rubric. For defining levels of success, here's my 3 goals that I would aim for. One is aim for clarity and objectivity. So you want students to be able to understand this easily, and you want them to be somewhat objective, so that you're not just saying, the style is good, but what is it that makes the style good, right? It's clear or it's easy to understand. You can't always be 100% objective, but try to write your success definitions in ways that lean toward objectivity, and also clarity, so that the difference between one level and the next is easy to discern. This will save you time when you're grading, because it will make it much quicker to choose one level. Second, use constructive language, so that students don't feel hurt and discouraged when you cross some level of success that is lower than what they expected. So instead of saying, this is poor, or this the assignment failed to do this, or you could say, okay, this needs improvement. So think about if there's a way to say something more positively, more constructively, that's good. And then third, motivate students to excel. So specifically when you're writing your top levels of mastery, what might perhaps be excellent or earn an A grade, write that in a way that it's attractive, sort of not completely unattainable, but also that it's clear, okay, this is a significant success if you can reach that, so that people will strive in that direction. I'm going to work through one of my examples, just to show how some of this might apply in practice. I teach biblical studies, so this is from biblical theology, but that's only going to make a difference for the learning outcomes. Beyond that, I think it's pretty similar to other kinds of rubrics that might be written in other assessments, particularly in the humanities. So learning outcomes from this course include to identify themes, issues, and approaches that are relevant in biblical theology, then to integrate different ways of research, so literary, theological, and historical analyses, and then third, research topics of biblical theology, considering different contexts. This is not all the learning outcomes for the course, but it's the ones that are most relevant for this assessment, which was the final paper in the course. And then here are some tasks that students are going to do when they complete that assignment. So they will identify a topic and research question, right? I'm not just providing a research question that's ready-made, but they have to think of one and refine it themselves. They have to analyze relevant evidence. They have to interact critically with other scholars, with secondary sources, and then they have to write clearly and coherently. So these tasks are then things that I can assess with criteria. In terms of the criteria that I'm going to focus on, that was style, thesis, structure, and citations. So in our program, one of the sort of skills that students learn is how to write correct bibliographic citations. And beyond that, the others are pretty familiar as well, right? Style in terms of writing academic English. That's clear. Thesis, having a thesis that's not too broad, not too narrow, that's somewhat significant as well. That's interesting. And then that's also supported with adequate evidence, and then structuring the paper in terms of having a introduction, conclusion, and clear sections. And then here I'm going to focus on the thesis just to show how you might write different levels of success. So this is what I mean with the criterion of thesis. An excellent paper would have a thesis that is clear, significant, and supported with sufficient evidence. Whereas an average or a good thesis might be clear, but perhaps more evidence is needed to demonstrate significance of the thesis, or perhaps more evidence is needed to support the thesis to show that it's viable. And then a C would be first of an average or below, slightly below average paper would be one where the thesis is too broad or too narrow. And then below that, even when you don't have a thesis or the thesis is unclear. So this is just one criterion, that was the thesis. I would then go back and do the same thing for the others as well. Now, in this case, I've laid it out in a table like this just so that you can read it. If I have the whole table, it becomes a bit too small to show well on PowerPoint. But actually, when I'm writing the rubric, I would just do it straight in the table so I don't have to then reformat that. So I end up with something that looks like what I had for the idea, like this analytic rubric. So what I talked about just now, the thesis, that's that column where I just put these different levels of success in there, and then I would do the same for the other criteria. I'm going to pause again at that point and ask if there's any further questions or comments. Maybe actually the online folks didn't hear anything of what I just said, which is yes.
I'm wondering, do you follow the same rubric for master's, graduate, and undergraduate program, or do you make changes?
Yes, I make changes depending on the level. Both also within undergraduate, if it's a 200 level course or 300, 400. So I do adjust based on level. Just and similarly, to some extent, the learning outcomes will be also adjusted. Any other comments, perhaps experiences, suggestions, advice from our experienced colleagues?
I don't think so. We have anything
All right, lovely.
from the online participants. No.
So we're going to take about 5 to 10 minutes in a moment for you to think of assignments, or I think there was an invitation to bring some of your assessments to this session to work on and think through. And then I would be eager to have a bit of a question, answer, or even conversation. If you have some, say you're writing a new rubric and you have some questions about, say, what criteria to use, perhaps we can sort of help each other out there. Or also, if you are bringing an existing rubric and you're working on revising and troubleshooting that, what are the things that we can do there. So I'm going to, I have one more slide about what to do after you finish writing rubrics. So I'll go through that as well. But just as a heads up, if you brought an assignment or an assessment that you want to write a rubric for or revise an existing rubric, we'll have time for that in a moment. And then based on that, we're going to have another conversation with Q&A where hopefully also we'll get some input from the folks online. And then if you did bring one, then I would encourage you just take some assessment that you've done, maybe even the most recent assessment that you had in one of your courses. If it doesn't have a rubric yet just write one. It's actually not that hard to get started. You can also always revise the rubric later and just see how it goes, see what difference the rubric makes. So even for some of my smallest assessments, say in class, right, quite simple in class activities, I still try to move towards using rubrics because it provides clarity and it provides clarity both for the students and then also tends to make things easier for me like coming back to something, especially courses that I'm going to teach again in the future. So just pick up some assignment that you last did, or even an in-class assessment, write some rubrics for that. My last slide here, some things to keep in mind after designing a rubric. So immediately the next step would be to post the rubric on Moodle. Now, the first thing could be maybe you wrote it in Word or Excel. You can just post that file on Moodle, or you can copy and paste it into your syllabus, or if you have a say, Word doc or PDF that is describing the assignment included at the end of that assignment. So just add it there. Beyond that, there's more sophisticated things that you can do on Moodle that we should talk about another time. So specifically, the way that you can enter criteria into Moodle, and then you can actually end up, if you have assignments that are submitted on Moodle and you're using the Moodle rubric function, you can actually grade them super fast because you just click on the levels of success for each criteria, and then Moodle will automatically populate the grade. There's other things to do if you don't want to go to Moodle, if that's like a little bit too complex for the assignment that you're using, or say you have something that you're doing in class that where you're not using a Moodle assignment. You can still use, Excel. You can enter the formula into Excel. There's a couple of things to make your life easier in terms of the workflow. But the very first step is post the rubric so that students can see it and work with it. Then beyond that, once you're scoring the assessment, make sure to use the rubric, and then after that, provide the scored rubric to the students so that they can see your feedback and how they did on each assessment, and then hopefully improve for the future. Keep up notes for future revisions. So typically when I'm using a rubric for a class, I am running into either, questions or sometimes I'm noticing, okay, this level of success is not quite defined right. Or I finished using it for a batch and I feel like, okay, there's a bunch of papers here that ended up with a B grade based on the rubrics, but I really don't feel they're that strong. And then you can keep notes. Don't change the rubric as you're going because that would be unfair to the students if you're shifting the goalposts. But keep notes in some document wherever you keep your files for that course. Keep notes somewhere, and then the next time you get to that, you can revisit that rubric. You've already got your notes there from the experience that you had last time. Then periodically revise the rubric. My recommendation would be to do that every time you're going to teach a course for the next time. Then at the start of the semester, look through your rubrics and see if anything needs to change. And then also consult your rubrics, consult your scholars, your colleagues and students about how they are working, what they think about your rubric, and if students are finding it helpful. All right, that's all for right now. I'm going to stop for about 5 minutes. Encourage you to have a look at the assignments that you brought, or even if you thought of an assessment right now that you want to create a rubric for. Start by thinking of the learning goals and then write down some criteria based on that, and just see how far you get. And then in 5 minutes, we're going to have another conversation to see sort of what are areas where maybe we can help each other out, get some further clarity, or share how it's going. All right, thank you.
We will repeat the question for the online participants so that they can also participate. All right, so been asked to repeat the question. Right now, we're going to invite you to take your assessment, whatever assessment you brought here to this session in order to write a rubric for that. Or perhaps if you didn't bring one, just think of the last assessment that you did in class that you don't yet have a rubric for, and just write. So do that for about 5 minutes, and then we'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll wrap up the session after that. Online participants, if you want to participate, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. And you can have the chat with the expert. If you come up with questions before the ask for questions, as you're working on comments and questions, please send them through the chat or if you're in person. Let's start talking about this. For the online participants, I have launched the Zoom polling. You are requested to please respond to that as well.
Thank you, Daniel. How did you find the session? Is Daniel there, Gohar?
Yes, ma'am, he's there. We're waiting for the participants.
Yeah, for their feedback.
We're waiting for
Yes.
questions from participants. So as we are
Yeah.
rubrics, we're going to talk about how we're finding that.
Yeah, I have one comment from Muhammad Ramzan who says, can this session please be rearranged? There was a lot of distortion. The problem is, no many times how we arrange this session, the distortion is going to remain probably because IT does not know what the problem is in distortion. And we are assuming that it is a lack of internet speed that creates this distortion. The best option would be to join in person, but we have noticed that though a lot of you give a register for in-person session, your in-person participation is very poor. And so either way, that's a choice you have to make, how you want to have this session conducted. We will, I really think we need a better idea in your registration. and you do not state the modality appropriately, which leads us to lots of logistical issues. Uh, I hope, but Daniel, what do you think apart from the distortion? We had a very sort of passive audience. And it seems, or the other option is that perhaps people were more comfortable with basic rubrics. I am going to make these two assumptions. What do you think?
Yes, I think certainly a lot of people are comfortable already with basic rubrics because it's something that we have, rightly focused on and encourage people. But the other thought is perhaps if we upgraded the refreshments, then more people would come to take the session in person.
Daniel, I love that idea. How about floating it in your, in the VR meetings or something? We have to beg and scrounge for our budget every time there's something to be done. Apparently, CLT gets a better budget than most of other departments for our work, because I totally agree. If I were to be there in person, I would go for what is on offer in refreshments. I totally agree to that. We can try. Why don't you give us an option and we'll see if we can sort of change the menu. I'm happy to do that.
I was not complaining. There's some very good, I see pakora and cookies and tea and wonderful things. So I'm actually going to, with your permission, Dr. Zana, I'm going to ask, are there any specific questions or suggestions, perhaps? What's your experience right now as you're working on your rubric?
Yeah.
I don't see currently any questions in the chat so far as I can see them from here. But what are you finding as you're working on this? I will say maybe one more thing I could have mentioned earlier while I'm waiting for feedback and questions. When in terms of deciding between an analytic rubric and a holistic rubric, I find myself most often gravitating to the analytic rubric, but I find that there are 3 situations where I tend to like the holistic rubric more. So for me, analytic rubric is kind of in my work the default that I use, but I like to use a holistic rubric either when I'm first writing a rubric, and maybe I haven't used the rubric for this assessment before, and I just want to write down so that I have some written expectations. What should it look like if you're going to get an A? What should it look like if you're going to get a B? And then a holistic rubric is a very easy way to start, because you just start writing, okay, this is what the paper looks like. That is excellent. This is what a paper looks like. That is good, and so on. And the other situation where I like to use a holistic rubric is for really simple assignments, especially in-class assessments. But something in class, and maybe it's relatively quick, or there's lots of them happening in one class session, then I don't have time to go through 5 criteria. I like to just select one, but it's still good to have the rubric so that I can remind myself, okay, this is what I'm looking at here, this is what I'm looking at there for that assignment. And then the third situation where I like to use holistic rubrics is if the different criteria interact a lot, like if they all influence each other, it's difficult to separate them out. Then it's easier to describe the levels of achievement holistically rather than separating them with distinct rubrics.
I agree. Yeah. There seems to be. Yeah.
And when I've done liquid work, I'm not sure whether I've done holistic rubric of rubric or analytic one, but I've done liquid work on it. So the objective is, first of all, we talk about essay writing, and objective is that students are able to write a proper essay with 5 paragraphs, right? So the for A grade, they will have a coherent essay that is also cohesive, and there will be perfect sentence structure, proper introduction, their thesis statement, proper facts, and examples, proper conclusion, and this essay will have 5 paragraphs. For B grade, they will have coherence and cohesion, but there will be some typos in grammar, the introduction is a bit lengthy, then it's described by the teacher. Then thesis statement is clear, but there is just one example, and conclusion is also lengthy, and paragraphs might be clear. For a student who's scoring C, his essay will be incoherent, it will lack cohesion, it starts without an introduction or clear thesis statement. It's followed by facts or examples, and no conclusion, and 3 paragraphs. Then for a student who's getting D in it, his work is going to be all incoherent, will totally lack cohesion, no proper introduction or thesis statement. It's not clear, no conclusion, not clear about the difference between paragraph and an essay. It's not at all clear about it, that whether it's supposed to be writing a proper paragraph or what.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing. And this is, have you seen some of these examples,
Yes.
the different success
Yeah.
levels? Okay,
I've been
very nice.
doing my whole like my life, like students are not able to understand mostly that what the difference between essay and paragraph. Then we have to talk about it a lot of class. That well,
All right, thank you so much
The
for sharing.
sound is not, I'm sorry, the sound is not very clear. If we could have, apparently the participant was talking about her rubric that she uses for her assignment, right?
I'm talking about a rubric that I have created for essay writing. Can you hear me, ma'am?
And now it's better if you keep the mic closer to you.
Yes, it was a bit far from the topic, that's why maybe. So talked about all the 4 grades, that how the students are going to be getting grading. So should I repeat it now?
No, it's fine. It sounds to me like a holistic rubric in that you have for each level of
Yeah.
grade, you have
Yeah.
sort of all the description
All the
together.
descriptions there.
We're just running a little bit short on time.
Yes.
I don't think we need
Yeah.
to
Okay,
keep the whole thing.
Thank you.
so for an analytic one, will I have to have just one criterion, then I'll be talking about,
So,
for instance, just as you talked about one, like thesis, and you talked about thesis and all that. So will I be talking about just coherence in there if I am supposed to write about analytic
right.
rubrics?
So for an analytic rubric, it works much the same way, but you separate the criteria. So then, for example, you would go through all the levels and pick out the ones that talk about structure, right? So, and then separate them into one criteria by structure, and then for each of those, use that. And then for
Yes, I do understand.
Yes.
You're saying that different portions are going to be discussed then. Like for structure, it's going to be different, for cohesion, it's
Right,
going to be
yes.
different for other aspects as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any last minute questions? I don't see any online.
Yeah.
All right.
May I add, Daniel, that if you could talk about this intermediate level or the advanced level of rubrics that you will be, perhaps we will be having one session, and that if, yeah.
We'll have a session on advanced rubrics. And for that, there's 2 things that I would focus on. One is sort of situational aspects. So say you have a course and you have different phases in that course, different places where you're doing assessments. How do you adjust your rubrics to work best in different situations in the course, and how can they work together, in particular if you have an assignment that has several stages and you want to use separate criterion, but it's still one assessment in the end as well. So where is what is most helpful in which situation? And the aspect that focus on what you to include in the session on advanced rubrics is workflows. How can you make your work easier for yourself as an instructor once you have the rubric all set up, in terms of, for example, getting it into Moodle and then using the rubric function there, or other aspects that you can do about your grading workflow that leverage the power of rubrics to save time and optimize the experience for students as well.
Okay. So I think the voice has been pretty nasty. there was a lot of distortion, and I apologize for this. I have no idea how to have it resolved. But Daniel, thank you so much for your time and a lovely presentation. It was very simple and straightforward. So first-time starters would be encouraged to take it on without being overwhelmed. Totally appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.